The year was 1964. The document resting on the mahogany table in the center of the boardroom was not just a contract, it was a coronation. $5 million for a series of 3 television specials, fully sponsored by the monolithic Sterling Motor Company. In today's money, that sum would be astronomical, but in 1964, it was simply unheard of. It was the kind of money that could buy a small country, or at the very least, an entire movie studio. The ink was wet. The fountain pen was still resting in the heavy crystal ashtray. The executives from Detroit were smiling, their teeth gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the Burbank studio offices, convinced they had just bought the soul of the most famous man on planet Earth. They believed that Frank Sinatra, the man who had clawed his way back from the depths of irrelevance to the pinnacle of Hollywood, would never jeopardize a payday of this magnitude. But 10 minutes later, that contract would be in pieces on the floor, mixed with the ash of a cigarette that had been angrily crushed into the expensive carpet. The silence that followed was not the respectful silence of a church, but the terrified vacuum that occurs after a bomb has detonated. The executives were pale, the lawyers were trembling, and Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, was walking toward the elevator with a stride that suggested he would burn the entire building down before he compromised an inch of his soul. He left behind the money. He left behind the prime-time slot. But he took something far more valuable with him. He took the dignity of an elderly cello player named Elias, a man the sponsors had tried to erase from the screen because they thought his presence might offend viewers in the Deep South. It was a moment that never made the headlines in Variety, but it defined the man behind the tuxedo more than any song he ever sang. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? To understand why Frank Sinatra was willing to incinerate $5 million in a single afternoon, you have to understand the ghosts that haunted him. The world saw the swagger, the snap-brim hat, the cufflinks, and the Jack Daniels. They saw the man who held Las Vegas in the palm of his hand. But when Frank looked in the mirror, he didn't see the king of entertainment. He often saw the skinny, scared kid from Hoboken, New Jersey. He saw a boy who had been called slurs because of his Italian heritage, a boy who had been looked at as less than by the Anglo-Saxon elite of America. He remembered the hunger, not just the physical hunger of the Depression, but the hunger for respect, the desperate, clawing need to be seen as a human being. Frank carried the memory of the late 1940s like a physical scar. He remembered when his voice failed him, when the phone stopped ringing, when the same executives who now worshipped him wouldn't even take his calls. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that fame was a vapor. He knew that the people in the boardroom didn't love him. They consumed him. And because he knew how fragile success was, he had developed a code, a rigid, unbreakable set of laws that governed his world. The first law was loyalty. The second law was dignity. You didn't punch down. You didn't let the big guys bully the little guys. If you were with Frank, you were under his protection, whether you were a king or a janitor. If you enjoy hearing the truth behind the legends, please subscribe for new stories. The deal with Sterling Motors was supposed to be the capstone of his comeback. The Sinatra, A Man and His Music series was pitched as a revolutionary television event. No gimmicks, no dancers, just Frank and a massive orchestra, delivering the American songbook into the living rooms of 50 million people. The sponsor, Sterling Motors, was conservative. They were a company built on tradition, selling cars to the suburban heartland of America, a heartland that, in 1964, was currently tearing itself apart over the issue of civil rights. The Civil Rights Act was being debated in Washington, cities were burning, and the racial tension in the country was a wire pulled so tight it hummed. Frank didn't care about the politics of car salesmen. He cared about the music. He had personally selected every member of the orchestra. He didn't hire based on color. He hired based on the sound. If you could play, you were in. If you couldn't, you were out. It was the only democracy that mattered to him. Among the musicians he had handpicked was Elias Thorne, a 62-year-old African-American cellist whose hands carried the history of jazz and classical music in every callus. Elias was a quiet man. He wore suits that were frayed at the cuffs, but impeccably pressed. He spoke rarely, communicating mostly through the deep, resonant wood of his instrument. Frank loved him. He loved the sorrow Elias could pull out of a string. He loved the way Elias closed his eyes when the tempo slowed down, lost in a world where only the notes existed. The first 2 days of rehearsals at the NBC studios in Burbank were magic. The sound was thick, lush, and perfect. The arrangement for It Was a Very Good Year was coming together, building a sonic cathedral that Frank could inhabit. The executives from Sterling Motors were present, watching from the glass-walled control booth, nodding their heads, calculating their profits. The lead executive was a man named Harrison Vance. Vance was the embodiment of corporate sterility, a man who viewed art only as a vehicle to move units of steel and rubber. He watched the rehearsals with the cold, dead eyes of a shark. On the morning of the third day, the mood in the studio shifted. There was a tension in the air, a static charge that pricked the skin. Frank arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, looking immaculate in a gray sharkskin suit, a cup of coffee in one hand, and a cigarette in the other. He said hello to the crew, winked at the script girl, and took his place at the center microphone. The orchestra began to tune up, that chaotic, beautiful swarm of noise that precedes the order of a song. Frank turned to the string section, catching Elias's eye. "You ready to make them cry today, Elias?" Frank asked. Elias smiled, a shy, gentle expression. "Yes, Mr. Sinatra. We're ready." But before the conductor could lift his baton, the heavy door to the soundstage opened. Harrison Vance walked in, flanked by 2 junior executives who carried clipboards like shields. Vance didn't look at the orchestra. He didn't look at the crew. He walked straight to the producer, whispered something, and then turned his gaze toward Frank. The producer, a man named Jerry, who had known Frank for years, looked pale. He walked over to Frank, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Frank," Jerry said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Vance has a creative note regarding the visual composition of the orchestra." Frank took a drag of his cigarette, his blue eyes narrowing. "A creative note? He sells convertibles, Jerry. What does he know about visual composition?" "It's about the wide shots, Frank," Jerry continued, his voice trembling slightly. "Sterling Motors feels that, well, they're worried about the southern affiliates. They think the string section looks a bit mixed. They want to know if we can move Elias." Frank didn't move. He didn't blink. The smoke from his cigarette curled up around his face, creating a mask. "Move him where?" "Ideally," Jerry swallowed hard, "off camera. Maybe into the recording booth. Or we could just replace him for the broadcast. Just for the visual, Frank. He still gets paid. Full rate. But Vance says his demographics in Alabama won't like seeing a black man sitting next to the white violinists." The silence that descended on Frank Sinatra was terrifying. It wasn't the loud, explosive anger that people associated with him. It was a cold, absolute, zero stillness. He dropped his cigarette to the floor and crushed it out with the toe of his Italian loafer. Then, without saying a word to Jerry, he unhooked the microphone from its stand. He began to walk toward Harrison Vance. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the cavernous studio. Every musician stopped tuning. Every technician froze. Elias, sitting in the back, lowered his bow, sensing that the air in the room had suddenly become poisonous. Frank stopped 3 feet from the executive. He looked Vance up and down, examining his expensive tie, his manicured fingernails, his smug expression of authority. "I hear you have a problem with my orchestra," Frank said. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, which made it infinitely more dangerous than a shout. Vance smiled, a tight, corporate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Not the orchestra, Frank, just the optics. We have to be realistic about the market. We're selling a fantasy here, an American fantasy, and in certain parts of this country, seeing a Negro in the string section, it breaks the spell. We're just asking for a small adjustment, for the good of the show." Frank looked at Elias. The old man was looking down at his shoes, his hands gripping the neck of his cello. He looked small. He looked resigned. He looked like a man who had heard this speech 1,000 times before in 1,000 different rooms. And seeing that resignation on Elias's face broke something inside Frank. It triggered the memory of his own father, quiet and beaten down. It triggered the memory of Sammy Davis Jr. having to walk through the kitchen of the hotels he was headlining. Frank turned back to Vance. "You want me to fire the best cello player in Los Angeles because you're afraid of some bigots in Alabama?" "We're not firing him," Vance corrected quickly. "We're just hiding him. It's business, Frank. Be reasonable. This contract is worth $5 million. Are you really going to make a scene over one musician? If you believe in standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe for new stories to support this channel." Frank laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "Reasonable," he repeated. "You want me to be reasonable?" He turned to the orchestra. "Pack it up, fellas." The room gasped. Vance's eyes went wide. "Excuse me?" "I said pack it up," Frank shouted, his voice finally booming with the Jersey power that could rattle windows. "The session is over. The show is over." "You can't do that," Vance sputtered, his face flushing red. "We have a contract. We have advertisers lined up. You can't just walk away." Frank stepped into Vance's personal space. The chairman mask was gone. This was the street fighter from Hoboken. "Listen to me, you empty suit. You don't buy me. You buy the music. And the music is those men, all of them. If Elias isn't good enough for your camera, then I'm not good enough for your microphone." "You'll be in breach of contract," Vance screamed. "We'll sue you. We'll ruin you. You'll never work in television again." Frank reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the folded copy of the contract he had signed just days before. He held it up so Vance could see it clearly. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he tore it down the middle. "Rip." He put the halves together and tore them again. "Ripe." He threw the confetti of legal paper into the air, letting it rain down between them. "Sue me," Frank said. "But know this. If you ever disrespect a man on my stage again, I won't just walk out. I'll make sure the world knows exactly why. Now get out of my sight before I lose my temper." Vance stood there, mouth open, watching $5 million disintegrate on the floor. He looked around for support, but the room was against him. The cameramen were glaring. The lighting guys were gripping their wrenches. Frank Sinatra had drawn a line in the sand, and everyone knew which side they wanted to be on. Vance turned and stormed out, his entourage scrambling to keep up. When the door slammed shut, the silence returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't fearful. It was heavy with awe. Frank turned back to the orchestra. He looked at Elias, who had slowly raised his head. There were tears in the old man's eyes. Not of sadness, but of disbelief. In 1964, powerful white men did not throw away fortunes to defend the dignity of black musicians. It simply didn't happen. Frank walked over to the string section. He didn't make a speech. He didn't wait for applause. He simply put a hand on Elias's shoulder and squeezed it gently. "Sorry about the interruption, Elias," Frank said quietly. You okay?" "I'm okay, Mr. Sinatra," Elias whispered. "But the money, you just lost." "I didn't lose anything I can't make back," Frank interrupted, winking. "But I can't buy a sound like yours. Now, since we're all here and the suits are gone, why don't we play some music, just for us?" And that is exactly what they did. For the next 3 hours, in a studio with no cameras rolling, no sponsors watching, and no money on the table, Frank Sinatra and his orchestra played. They played with a ferocity and a joy that none of them had felt in years. They played "One for My Baby" and "I've Got You Under My Skin." Elias played the solo of his life, his cello singing with a mixture of sorrow and liberation that brought goosebumps to everyone in the room. Frank sang not for the audience, but for the band. He sang to wash the taste of the boardroom out of his mouth. The fallout was immediate and messy. Sterling Motors pulled their funding. The network panicked. The lawyers screamed. For a few weeks, it looked like the entire project was dead. Rumors swirled in Hollywood that Sinatra was becoming difficult, that he was unstable. But Frank didn't flinch. He went to a competing sponsor, a beer company that didn't care who played the cello as long as the ratings were high. He renegotiated the deal. He got less money, significantly less, but he kept total creative control. When A Man and His Music finally aired in 1965, it won an Emmy Award and a Peabody Award. It is widely considered one of the greatest television specials ever made. And right there, in the string section, in every wide shot, in full view of Alabama, New York, and the world, sat Elias Thorne. He was playing his cello, looking dignified, looking proud, an integral part of the American landscape that Frank Sinatra insisted on showing. But the story doesn't end there. Years later, when Elias passed away, his family found a letter among his possessions. It was dated a week after the incident at the Burbank studio. It was handwritten on personalized stationery that read, "Francis Albert Sinatra." The note was brief. It simply said, "Elias, thank you for the music. The world is better because you're in it. Your friend, Frank." Inside the envelope was a check. It wasn't for $5 million, but it was enough to pay off the mortgage on Elias's house completely. Frank had never mentioned it to anyone. He didn't do it for the publicity. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to be the little guy. And he knew that sometimes the only way to balance the scales of the world is to put your thumb on the side of kindness. Before we continue to the final emotional twist of this night, please subscribe for new stories so you don't miss our next documentary. The legacy of that afternoon in 1964 isn't found in the record charts. It's found in the quiet loyalty that the music industry had for Frank. Musicians knew. They knew that when the chips were down, Frank wasn't just a boss. He was a guardian. He was a man who understood that an artist's dignity is the source of their power. He knew that if you allow a man to be stripped of his pride, you kill the music inside him. And Frank Sinatra, for all his flaws, for all his temper and his darkness, was a protector of the music. Elias's grandson, who is now a musician himself, tells the story often. He talks about how his grandfather came home that day, not beaten down by the racism he faced, but uplifted by the defense he had received. He talks about how Elias practiced with a new fire after that day, how he walked taller. The money Frank lost meant nothing to the Sinatra estate in the long run. The millions came and went. But the impact on Elias's family lasted for generations. It taught them that they had worth. It taught them that they deserved to be seen. Frank Sinatra often sang about loneliness. He sang about the wee small hours of the morning. He knew that ultimately we all face the dark alone. But he also proved that day in Burbank that we don't have to be alone in the daylight. He proved that power is useless unless it is used to lift others up. He proved that the most exclusive clubs, like the Rat Pack or the boardrooms of corporate America, were worthless if they excluded good people. As the years went on, the industry changed. The suits got more powerful. The artists got less control. But the story of the torn contract remained a whisper in the recording studios of Los Angeles, a legend passed down from session player to session player. It became a reminder of a time when giants walked the earth. Not giants of commerce, but giants of character. Sometimes, late at night, when the applause has faded and the lights are out, the true measure of a man is not what he achieved, but what he refused to accept. Frank Sinatra refused to accept a world where Elias Thorne was invisible. And in doing so, he made himself immortal in a way that no song ever could. We are coming to the end of our journey today. If you have ever had to stand up for someone against the odds, subscribe for new stories and share your experience in the comments below. Frank Sinatra was many things: a singer, an actor, a lover, a fighter. But perhaps his greatest role was the one he played that afternoon in Burbank. A decent human being who wasn't afraid to say no. He showed us that the price of integrity is high, but the cost of losing it is unbearable. He showed us that the music matters, but the people who make the music matter more. And he showed us that sometimes the most elegant thing you can do is tear up the contract, look a bully in the eye, and walk away. Thank you for watching. If you want to support more stories about the hidden history of music legends, please subscribe for new stories. We'll see you in the next video.